When did your own children stop asking for your advice and start making plans around you, as if you were already out of the picture, as if the years you spent protecting them had quietly turned into proof that you were no longer paying attention? I noticed it the moment decisions about my life were presented as already settled. The moment voices softened in that careful way people use when they think you won't push back, and suddenly I wasn't a parent anymore. I was a problem to be managed. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It crept in through small, unsettling moments, like conversations stopping when I entered the room, like paperwork appearing that I had never agreed to, like concern that felt less like care and more like control. For a while, I asked myself the same question many people my age do when something feels off. Was this love, or was this convenience dressed up as concern? I stayed quiet not because I was confused, but because I was watching, and there's a difference that people often underestimate. Silence, after all, is only weakness to those who don't understand what patience looks like. I had spent a lifetime learning when to speak and when to let others reveal themselves, and what unsettled me wasn't fear of losing anything. It was the quiet insult of realizing they believed I had already lost the ability to see clearly. They spoke with confidence, the kind that comes from assuming the outcome is secure, and that confidence alone told me more than any argument ever could, because people who are honest don't rush to lock doors before anyone asks why. There were nights when doubt tried to creep in, when I wondered if age had dulled my instincts, if maybe I was imagining patterns that weren't there. But every lesson earned through years of hard decisions told me this wasn't confusion. It was strategy unfolding without my consent. And so I let them believe their version of events, let them move forward with that quiet certainty people get when they think someone else has already surrendered. I nodded when necessary. I listened more than I spoke. I allowed them to think I hadn't noticed the shift, because sometimes the safest place to stand is exactly where everyone assumes you're powerless. What they never questioned was why someone who had weathered loss, sacrifice, and betrayal before would suddenly stop paying attention now, or why a person who had built everything they stood on would forget how easily structures collapse when built on false assumptions. While they congratulated themselves in subtle ways, mistaking my restraint for resignation, I was already aware of something they weren't ready to face yet. That the moment people rush to claim victory is usually the moment they've stopped checking whether the ground beneath them is solid at all, and by then it's already too late to pretend the game was ever in their control. The first thing that made it impossible to dismiss was not a feeling, but a series of actions. Mail addressed to me already opened and neatly stacked, documents left on the table with places marked as if my signature were a formality, and a conversation I overheard one afternoon that stopped the instant my footsteps were recognized. That was when observation turned into certainty. I didn't confront anyone or ask the questions burning in my mind, because people reveal far more when they believe nothing has been noticed. Instead, I watched patterns form. Appointments scheduled without asking me, explanations delivered only after decisions were made, and a calm, final tone that suggested discussion was no longer necessary. That tone mattered. It wasn't concern. It was confidence. And confidence like that only comes when people believe the outcome is already secure. That was when I took my first quiet step, one I hadn't planned on making so soon, and placed a phone call I never intended anyone to know about. I didn't explain myself. I didn't accuse. I asked one careful question. The pause on the other end of the line told me everything. From that moment on, doubt was no longer part of the equation. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was execution. At family gatherings, the shift became impossible to miss. Decisions announced instead of discussed, smiles that felt practiced, concern offered only when it supported a conclusion already reached. I responded politely. I agreed when agreement cost me nothing. I allowed the momentum to continue because people grow careless when they feel unchallenged. Another letter arrived. Another signature was assumed. Another explanation came too late to matter. Each time I noted it and said nothing because interrupting a plan too early only teaches people how to hide it better. There were moments when one sentence from me would have stopped everything, moments when I could have forced a confrontation, but restraint has its own discipline, and I understood something they didn't yet, that letting a plan reveal its full shape is sometimes the only way to see where it breaks. Their confidence hardened into entitlement. Assumptions replaced caution. And that certainty, their certainty, became the most useful thing they could have given me, because by the time they believed everything important was already handled, I no longer needed to guess what they were trying to take or how they expected it to end. I knew the structure. And once you know the structure of a betrayal, you also know exactly where it cannot survive pressure. What followed wasn't dramatic, but it carried more weight than anything before, because the more clearly I saw what was happening, the more I had to confront what stopping it would actually cost me. Things began moving faster. Documents finalized, timelines mentioned casually, urgency appearing where there had once been none, and I found myself spoken to less as a person and more as a requirement that needed to be handled carefully. Decisions were framed as protection, as responsibility, as something they were taking on for my own good, and that was when the real conflict surfaced, because objecting would mean acknowledging a betrayal no parent ever wants to believe exists. I watched as concern became justification and responsibility turned into leverage, and I realized how easily good intentions can be used to disguise control once power is assumed. More than once, I nearly spoke, the words forming clearly in my mind, but each time I imagined what would follow. Denial delivered calmly, explanations that sounded reasonable, a fracture that could never be fully repaired, and I understood that once silence was broken, there would be no returning to observation. The pressure increased in small, methodical ways. Reminders framed as favors, deadlines presented as necessities, gentle suggestions that resistance would only make things harder for everyone involved. The date was already set. That single fact changed everything, because it made clear this was no longer a discussion unfolding. It was a conclusion approaching. What weighed on me most wasn't fear of loss, but the realization that preserving harmony now meant surrendering any claim to dignity later. I had spent my life believing that parents endure discomfort so their children don't have to, yet here I was, understanding that my restraint was no longer protective, it was permissive. This wasn't a choice between peace and conflict. It was a choice between temporary discomfort and permanent surrender. Still, I hesitated because morality doesn't disappear just because you've been wronged, and acting decisively meant accepting that I would be seen, at least by some, as the source of disruption. I measured the decision not by outcome alone, but by conscience, because whatever followed had to be something I could live with. Meanwhile, their confidence grew more visible, assumptions spoken openly now, caution replaced by certainty, and that certainty told me exactly how they believed this would end. In that moment, listening to plans discussed as if my role were symbolic rather than essential, I made a decision that felt final, not to confront, not to withdraw, but to allow one last step forward, knowing that once it happened, there would be no way for any of us to pretend this was ever about protection again. The mistake didn't come from cruelty or anger. It came from confidence that had gone unchecked for too long, the kind that convinces people they no longer need to be careful. It showed itself the day I was informed, not asked, that arrangements had been finalized, details already shared, and that my role was simply to agree so everything could move forward smoothly. The language was calm, almost rehearsed, but there was something new underneath it. Impatience. That impatience mattered, because it meant the timeline mattered more than my consent. They spoke openly now, assuming alignment, assuming silence meant acceptance, assuming that whatever authority I once held had already been transferred without resistance. One document was placed in front of me with an explanation that arrived too late to shape anything. Another decision was mentioned casually, as if it had been discussed with me weeks ago. It hadn't, and in that moment, I understood they had crossed an invisible line, not legally yet, not loudly, but morally, by acting as though my agreement was guaranteed rather than required. I said very little. I asked one neutral question. The response came quickly, confidently, and incorrectly. That was the mistake. When people rush to reassure instead of clarify, they often reveal what they don't realize they've misunderstood. From then on, the missteps compounded. Assumptions layered on top of assumptions, explanations that contradicted earlier ones, small inconsistencies brushed aside because no one expected me to notice them anymore. Deadlines were shortened. Pressure disguised itself as concern. I was reminded, gently but firmly, that delaying would complicate things for everyone. That insistence told me everything I needed to know, because people who are acting properly don't fear a pause. Still, I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them. I allowed the process to advance just far enough to expose its weakest point, because once something is put in motion publicly, it can no longer be quietly undone. They believed they were being efficient. They believed they were protecting me. In reality, they were committing themselves to a version of events that depended entirely on my continued silence. And silence, when mistaken for surrender, becomes a liability. There was a moment, brief, almost unremarkable, when one of them spoke with certainty about an outcome that had not yet occurred, referencing authority that had not yet been granted. It was said casually. It was said confidently. And it was said too soon. That single assumption confirmed what I had suspected all along. They weren't just planning around me. They were counting on me not pushing back once the structure was already standing. That was when patience turned into leverage. I realized then that the very speed they believed secured their position had created something they couldn't control. A paper trail, witnesses, commitments made before permission was earned. By the time they noticed my questions had become fewer and my responses more measured, it was already too late to reverse course quietly, because the mistake had already been made, and all that remained was for its consequences to arrive. The reveal didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, in places where assumptions could no longer protect them. The meeting they had been carefully arranging finally happened, not the way they intended, but in front of people who were not supposed to be part of the story yet. Papers were presented again, concerns were repeated, and the familiar language returned. Stress, confusion, protection. But this time it didn't land the way it had before, because I wasn't alone, and the structure they believed was solid began to show its gaps. Questions were asked that had never been rehearsed. Dates were checked. Authority was clarified. And slowly, visibly, the confidence that had carried them this far began to thin. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I simply answered when asked, clearly and without emotion, and that clarity did more damage than any argument ever could. One explanation contradicted another. One assumption fell apart under a single follow-up question. The room changed in subtle ways. Posture shifting, voices tightening, pauses growing longer. And for the first time, I saw uncertainty where certainty had lived for months. Someone suggested a delay. Someone else asked for clarification. The process stalled, not because I demanded it, but because the foundation no longer held. What struck me most in that moment wasn't relief or satisfaction, but recognition, because I could see them realizing, one by one, that the silence they had relied on was never confusion, and the patience they had mistaken for compliance had been intentional all along. They tried to recover quickly, to reframe, to explain, but once momentum breaks publicly, it doesn't come back quietly. Commitments that had been spoken aloud could not be unsaid. Records existed now. Timelines had been acknowledged. The version of events they were counting on required a level of agreement I had never given, and suddenly that absence mattered. I watched as the focus shifted away from me and onto the inconsistencies they could no longer smooth over, and in that shift, the balance changed. There was no announcement, no declaration of wrongdoing, just a collective understanding forming in real time that something had been assumed too early and pushed too far. When the meeting ended, nothing had been finalized. Nothing could be. What they believed was already settled was now officially unresolved. And that uncertainty followed us out of the room in heavy silence. No one spoke on the way home. No explanations were offered. And for the first time since this began, I felt something settle, not triumph, not vindication, but the steady certainty that the outcome was no longer in their control alone. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as exposure, and once exposure starts, it doesn't need force to finish its work. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It spread slowly, through hesitation, through changes in tone, through the sudden absence of certainty that had once guided every conversation. Calls that used to come with direction now came with questions. Plans that had been presented as final were quietly revisited. The urgency that once drove everything forward evaporated, replaced by careful pauses and measured language. No one said the word mistake, but it hung in the air, unspoken and heavy. I noticed how often my input was requested now, how explanations were offered before decisions instead of after, and how the confidence that once dismissed my silence had retreated into something closer to caution. The reversal was subtle, but undeniable. Where authority had once been assumed, it now had to be earned again, and that shift changed the atmosphere inside the family more than any argument ever could. I didn't assert myself. I didn't remind anyone of what had happened. I simply responded when asked, clearly and without defensiveness, because when power returns naturally, it doesn't need to be announced. What surprised me most was not their discomfort, but my own restraint, because the opportunity to correct them, to reclaim ground loudly, was there, and I chose not to take it. That choice mattered because it made the reversal irreversible. Conversations slowed. Decisions were deferred. Even everyday interactions felt different, as though everyone was recalibrating where they stood. I could see it in the way sentences were softened, in how certainty gave way to careful phrasing, in how responsibility was no longer used as a shield but treated with hesitation. There were moments when one of them almost acknowledged what had happened, when the words hovered just short of apology, but they never crossed that line, and I understood why. Naming the shift would mean admitting it had never belonged to them in the first place. The balance had changed without confrontation, without punishment, simply because assumptions had failed under scrutiny. What they had relied on most, my continued silence, was no longer something they could control, and that loss unsettled them more than anger ever would have. I watched as boundaries reappeared where they had been quietly erased, as permissions replaced declarations, and as the future, once mapped out without me, became uncertain again. And in that uncertainty, something important returned to me, something I hadn't realized had been taken so gradually. My place not as an obstacle or a formality, but as a voice that could no longer be bypassed. The power shift wasn't about winning. It was about restoration, and once restored, it didn't need to prove itself to remain. Resolution did not arrive as an apology or a confession, and it did not need to. Justice does not always require admission to be real. It arrived quietly, through changed behavior and through boundaries that slowly returned. Decisions were no longer rushed or assumed. They were discussed carefully, and that alone told me everything had shifted. The future that was once planned without me was revised, not all at once, but step by step, until it no longer looked like the certainty they once carried so easily. What was nearly taken was no longer taken at all, and what I almost lost returned without announcement. I was consulted again, not because it was expected, but because it was necessary, and that difference mattered more than any apology ever could. There were moments when tension surfaced, when the past pressed against the present, but it no longer held power over me, because the outcome had already changed. I did not demand acknowledgement. I did not repeat what led us here. I allowed silence to do its work, because silence, when chosen, becomes authority. Over time, the atmosphere settled into something steadier and more honest. The confidence that once drove everything was gone, replaced by awareness. Trust, once strained, now required care. I was not interested in teaching lessons or proving a point. I was interested in living the rest of my life with clarity and self-respect intact. And in that clarity, I understood something important. Justice does not always look like punishment delivered. Sometimes it looks like control returned. Sometimes it looks like dignity restored without bitterness. They never said they had underestimated me, but they no longer acted as though they could, and that was enough. What mattered most was not how they felt about what happened, but how I felt moving forward. Peace earned through awareness is different from peace maintained through surrender. I did not raise my voice or force an ending. I simply refused to disappear quietly, and that choice reshaped everything that followed. In the end, there was no celebration and no sense of triumph. There was only calm acceptance that the story had reached its natural conclusion, not with punishment, but with balance restored. And as I returned to my life, aware of how easily respect can be tested and how firmly it must sometimes be protected, I carried one certainty with me. Justice does not always announce itself, but when it arrives quietly, it tends to last.